MacKenzie, thank you so much for coming on Scaling Laws. I think that very few parents, when their child, I'm going to restart. See, this is already so, Mackenzie, thank you so much for coming on Scaling Laws. I am so excited to talk with you because most parents, when their student comes home from second grade and says, Mom or Dad, I'm bored, I'm just not getting a lot out of this, they say, oh, well, go off to recess and have more fun and lean into some special project. You said, let me start an entire new school. So I just want to pause at that moment and go back to the very origin of Alpha School. What inspired you to take this huge leap into starting something that is quite impressive?
Well, Kevin, thanks for having me, first of all. But one of the things that I think that people think about school generally is school is like eating your spinach. You do it because it's good for you. You don't necessarily enjoy it. You may not really feel like you're getting the benefits from it, but somebody says you gotta do it. And I think for me, that was very much how I grew up thinking about school. I was one of those kids who was very good at school. I knew how to get good grades. I was conscientious and willing to do the work, but I hated school. I absolutely hated school. In fact, I remember I would talk to my high school teachers and be like, wait, you actually chose to do this job? Like, that's what you want to do? And I'll never forget my last final at Stanford University. I walked out of that final and I literally tapped the top of my head and said, this is closed. I'm done. There is no more school happening in my life. And so, fast forward a few years when it was time for my little girls to head off to school, my husband and I sent them to our local public school in Austin, that's considered a phenomenal school district. We were both public school kids, and off they went. And just like I believe every single kid, my girls were both bright-eyed, bushy-tailed little gals that were curious and interested and excited to learn and go meet new people and do all of those things. But pretty quickly, we found ourselves frustrated with just lack of ability to provide any sort of individualized opportunities for them. And, that might have been, being in kindergarten, and my daughter would come home with worksheets that said A is for ant, B is for box, and it's like she was already reading chapter books. And she's a smart girl, but it wasn't like she was genius level. She was just kind of above average. Halfway through second grade, my daughter said to me one day, I don't want to go to school tomorrow. And I said, why not? You love school. And she looked at me and she just said, school is so boring. And I had a flashback to me where I was like, oh my goodness, she's going to spend the next several years of her life probably engaging and doing what she needed to do. Just like I did, although she could have easily taken the path that so many people do, which is kind of say like, screw this, I'm not going to engage in this, and I'm going to rebel, and I'm going to kind of check out. And I just was like, I can't watch this for the next several years. I can't see them doing that. The other thing that I felt like in my school journey is I didn't feel like school did a great job of helping me find the intersection of my passions and my talents, to really understand, like, here's something that you're interested in, go try it, go pursue it and see if it's something interesting. And so I was considered a success story. I went to a great college, but I sort of just did what I was told to do, as opposed to really being clear about, like, what do I love to do and how can I go create an experience on that. And so I looked around and I realized it wasn't about going from a public school to a different public school or going to the private school down the road. I realized it was a model issue. It was the idea of a teacher in front of a classroom teaching everybody in a time-based system that doesn't work. And for 40 years, since I was in elementary school, universities have done research that students can learn 2, 5, 10 times faster when they're given one-to-one mastery-based tutoring. Think think Plato, being able to tutor Aristotle, who tutored Alexander the Great. And obviously the teacher in front of the classroom model was born out of the industrial revolution, where we had to figure out how to really educate the masses. But every single one of those learning science papers would start or end with, these accelerated academic results are not possible in a teacher in front of the classroom model. And so I decided to look around and I didn't see anything I wanted. So I said, well, let's start it. So it is not lost on me the irony that I now spend a lot of my time in a school, given that I was one of those kids who said, I'm never setting foot in a school again as soon as I finish it.
I think it's awesome. And I think that the drive and the initiative and the vision you had is so exciting because we're at a moment in the so called age of AI where we need more and more people to be asking about whether the designs of institutions themselves are relevant for this age. As you did in the context of public school, which for some people they think reforming public school never going to happen, not going to touch that, I'm going to dodge that with a 10-foot pole. It's been the same way since, I don't know, time immemorial of just this is public school. And as you pointed out, we know that its roots are just not at all connected to modern society. We were trying to train factory workers, as you've pointed out, and even the school calendar, and this is the one that drives me nuts, we don't need summer. And all the kids who are listening to this podcast, so all three of them are thinking, okay, I'm never going to listen to this again. But
Okay, well,
summer
I'm
is
gonna challenge
outdated.
you there. I'm gonna
Yeah, yeah.
challenge you because one of the commitments we make at our schools is that kids will love school. They will love school, and so we survey our students every 6 weeks. Do you love school? Yes or no. We get like 96% at the end of the school year said they love school, but we take it even further and we say, would you rather go to school or go on vacation? And it depends on like what's the vacation the family has planned, that particular summer or Christmas break or whatever. But we generally get between 40 and 60% of our students say they'd rather go to school than go on vacation. And to take it even further, our high school students came to us this spring and asked if they could keep school open for the summer. And so guess who's in school this summer? Our high school students. That's how
I
much
love
they
it.
love school. And that's a really important thing. And the other thing I just want to really reiterate, Kevin, is it's not about public versus private school. It's about traditional education system versus being able to provide personalized one-to-one learning that engages and meets every single kid exactly where they need to be met. That's what artificial intelligence has finally enabled us to do. It's enabled us to take all of those learning science principles and really be able to meet a kid where they're at, both from a knowledge perspective as well as from the graph of interests that they have. But that's only about 10% of what creates a great learning experience. 90% is you have to have a motivated student. You have to have a student who's willing to put the work in, and that's I think the really key breakthrough that has made Alpha School so successful is we have transformed the role of our teachers to be able to focus on motivational and emotional support and mentorship and the ability to hold really high standards for kids while providing that high support. And that's where you create incredible motivation. In fact, University of Texas, one of your own, Dr. David Yeager, wrote a book that everybody should read called 10 to 25, The Science of Motivating Young People. And I was so excited when I met Dr. Yeager because now I don't have to write a book about it. Like he perfectly epitomized the philosophy that we've had around motivation. And I think that's really the key. And so all that kind of wrapping up, I think we as adults kind of think, well, kids will get educated the way we were educated. We turned out fine. And here's the thing, we no longer have to accept that mediocre experience. And I really think we should ask ourselves, if a kid can crush their academics in only a couple hours and make it so much more efficient, why in the world would we subject them to 6 hours of sitting in class doing academics? And for us, the answer is we won't. We want to unleash them in the afternoons to do life skills development, and that's how our students spend their afternoons in school, is doing life skills workshops.
Yeah, and I just think it's so important to flag that this science, this discovery in terms of knowing how students learn best, knowing the conditions in which they'll thrive, knowing how best to support them, this isn't new. And that's the thing
No.
from a public policy standpoint that drives me absolutely bonkers is operating from a perspective that the institution must endure rather than crafting the institutions around the science. And so I want to dive deeper into what a day actually looks like at Alpha School because I think for folks who have just done a perplexity search and come up with Alpha School, and they see 2 hours of rigorous learning, and it's AI based, and then they're doing whatever they want in the afternoon. Sounds like there's no spinach involved in that
Sounds
education. So, tell me why I'm wrong. Correct
no.
the headline.
Well, that is actually it's pretty good. Although it's your summary of it is, I think most people when they hear just a little bit, they're like, "Whoa, robot Terminator, dystopian, weird future scream school," and none of that is true. And it is a lot of fun. So first of all, our kids are in school, from 8:30 until 3:30 because school serves a lot of purposes. It's a daycare. It is a socialization environment. There's so much to do there. So, what we've done though is we've really given kids time back to be able to focus on more efficient learning that meets them where they're at. We fully believe, and I can tell you this is true, that competence leads to confidence. So when we take a kid who is working on math and they're working at exactly the right level where it's just challenging enough where their kind of brain is working, but it's not so hard that they're like, I'm terrible at math. I don't understand this, right? Um, and then they start seeing, okay, wow, I understand math. Guess what? You suddenly have a kid who's like, I like math. I'm good at math, right? And our classes are top 1% in the country. I don't think there's any other school that's really delivering the kind of academic results that we are. And so kids are getting that done, in a couple hours in the morning. We basically spend about 25 minutes on each of the core subjects, take breaks throughout the morning. By lunchtime, our kids are done with their academics, and the rest of the day is spent doing life skills workshops. And so that's everything from our kindergartners who did a 5-mile bike race, as a team without stopping, to our third and fourth graders who were able to go do a triathlon, to our middle school students who presented to the Miami Heat executive team about how they could use AI to enhance the game day experience and increase profits, to our high school students being able to build musicals that are going to be on Broadway and build businesses and raise funds, all kinds of activities like that. And so really what we've done is we've provided this environment that is unlocking the potential of our young people. And when you combine that with these phenomenal teachers, we call them guides, it's a pretty magical place. It's fun. It's a place I like hanging out. In fact, I wish I could go back and do it all over again as a kid myself.
Yeah, no, sign me up. Well, so we've got a savvy AI audience for this podcast,
Yeah,
and I'm sure the question everyone's asking is, tell me more about the AI. What are we actually
great.
talking about
Yeah.
with respect
So
to the
when
AI here?
when people think about AI in education, they always go to chatbot. They think, Conmigo, put a chat GPT on there. And actually, that's the one thing we do not use in our academic stuff because unfortunately, when you give a kid a chatbot, most of the time they use it to cheat. We have this desire to think that everyone would engage in Socratic discussion with their little, chatbot on their computer and say, Mackenzie, let me help you dive deeper into that US history, thing. And unfortunately, what a lot of kids do is copy paste what's the answer and put that in. So we don't use that. What we're using, we use several different LLMs, and we use the vision model, and then we use personalized learning plans. We don't use a chat feature in that. And so if you talk to one of our students at one of our schools, and you ask them about their AI learning, what they're going to talk to you about is how they use different adaptive apps. Depending on the subject, and that it kind of goes at their pace. Now, what we're doing, the vision model, is basically analyzing behind the scenes, and this is something that we've built. This, AI tutor, that's the platform underneath that is watching to see how accurate a student is and how long it's taking them, what level they're at. And so a good example of that is, a kid could be using an adaptive app and they might be guessing at the answers. They're not even taking time to read the question. Or if they get an answer wrong, they're not reading the explanation. And what will happen is they will receive coaching via the AI app that will say, hey, we noticed that you're going really quickly through the answers and your accuracy is not high. You need to take time to watch the video explanation or read the explanation. And if the kid isn't listening to that, it'll kind of slow them down and take their. The other big thing is that artificial intelligence now allows us to have a very precise and accurate measurement tool for how a student is learning and what they're learning. And one of the things that we can see is if a student starts struggling with a concept that they're not getting, we're able to go back and say, you know what? I think this kid needs to revisit a
Mhm.
concept from a week, a month, a year, 2 years ago. And let me give you a great example of that. We had a high school student this year, junior in high school, who was taking her SAT, working on getting her SAT, 740 math, just couldn't quite crack above 740. And she wants to go to a great college. She wants to get a high SAT score. Well, we put her back in fast math. We had her go back and do multiplication and division tables, and she went and did, a couple weeks worth of fast math. Got a 790 on her
Wow.
SAT. And I don't know many schools that would say, okay, junior in high school, we're going to have you go revisit multiplication table. But if you think about it, a lot of SAT math is just don't make dumb mistakes, as you're going through a time thing. And as part of that, you need to make sure that you're clear that, 7 times 5 is 35 and 9 times 9 is 81. And you can keep testing me. I'll see how I am on my fast math. But that's what we're able to do. And the same is true when we take a kid anywhere. So we have a student who will come to us and we'll be able to see, what, they've got some gaps in knowledge from third grade, from fourth grade, from fifth grade, and be able to go on from there. And on the other end of the spectrum, too, if a student is able to progress very quickly, the AI is able to analyze the information that a student has on how they're learning and go faster. And this brings a lot of learning science principles, for example, cognitive load theory, which is basically how many slots in your working memory do you have available to do something? Because if you start overloading your working memory, and in this example of the student with the math SAT, when she's having to use brain power to think of what 7 times 5 is, it's not enabling her to work on the rest of the problem. And so that's an example of something that we can make sure that a kid is never overwhelmed. We also are making sure that kids are learning to mastery. And so the kind of difference on the AI tool that we have running underneath versus just a regular adaptive app is that we up the mastery score for what is considered mastery. If you look at a lot of, Khan Academy as an example, 60 is their kind of smart score, right? 60% of grade material means you've mastered. No, that's not it at all.
I wish that was
And
the
so
threshold for mastery. I think I'd be a master in just about everything at 60%.
exactly. And so those are the things that we're looking at, but we're able to analyze, again, how long is it taking a child to answer a question? How accurate are they? Is their accuracy at the right level? Are they being challenged to the right degree? And then be able to fill holes. We also are able to take assessments. Now, a lot of alternative education schools, which you could put us in that bucket of, have stayed away from standardized assessments. But in our world, they are awesome because when we take the information we get from an assessment, we feed it into our AI tutor and we can go in and fill all those holes. It also gives just such a higher level of transparency for a parent, for our teachers who are looking at how the student is doing, and for our students. Our students are much more clear about how to proactively move forward in their academic journey, and they know, wow, if I put in this much time, I'll progress through this grade in a faster period. And so the results we're seeing are just absolutely insane. And basically, several different LLMs that we use to create the personalized learning plans. We use the vision model to be able to analyze how a student is doing, and then we use a combination of third-party apps that are out there, as well as some apps that we've built. And we've basically been able to kind of curate which apps are good for which subjects and which grade levels.
So I'm gonna put on my I have a kid hat. I full disclosure only have a niece and nephew. I care a great deal about them, so I'm just gonna wear my Funkle hat, the fun uncle, and
Wonderful.
ask some questions that I'm sure you get frequently. So let's start with one that arises in a lot of AI contexts, which is privacy, right? So
Hmm.
we're always concerned about the amount of data that AI may be hoovering up and using in certain contexts. That only gets amplified when we bring in kids' data and kids' data in an education context. So, how do you all safeguard the data collected and used for your students?
Yeah. Well, I first of all, I'm going to tell you one thing. I am not an expert in all of the kind of policy issues or the things. Here's what I'm an expert in. How do we educate kids? How do we put as much information into our kids' brains so that they can go be great critical thinkers as possible? So when people bring up the idea of data and privacy, we are getting so much data on how a kid is learning and how students are learning that I think is absolutely helping us understand how are we going to catapult an entire generation forward when it comes to education on that. So I don't get overly hung up, and I'm sure there's plenty of people who get hung up about the privacy concerns. But what I look at is, when a child and then their parents, and then our learning system is able to see, here's how kids go through a learning process. Here's the kind of lesson that works. Here's what makes sense. Here's what doesn't. I think that kind of takes us to different levels. So I may be sidestepping your privacy thing, but I look at this and I'm like, you mean the data about how well a kid is learning? That's great data to have. And you're right, we're collecting it and we are constantly improving our apps based on what we're learning about how people learn.
And I love that answer because my grave concern is that a lot of the privacy concerns we have that in many contexts are right to be held and right to be top of mind. But for so many of the positive use cases of AI, when you think about education, for example, when you think about public health, for example, we can't achieve those benefits unless we have good data. And in fact,
Yeah,
you're going to get crappier AI models if you refuse to provide them with high quality, relevant data. And so
yeah.
there's this weird cultural backlash that we have to get over to see AI used in its most positive use cases.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's some arguments for data, but the kind of data that we're able to collect through this learning system it's great data that is, again, it's building out how quickly people learn. And I will say this, right now we have, our students learning in about 2 hours a day, all core subjects. I believe there will be a point in the next 5 years where we're at 1 hour learning
Wow.
because we're going to learn how to provide better lessons that meet students where they're at. Another example of some of the learning science principles that we're able to incorporate as a result of generative AI is, Kevin, if it takes you 5 reps in order to learn a concept, 5 questions that you run through and you've got that concept, then you shouldn't have to go through 10 reps. And if it takes me 15 reps to learn that same concept, then I shouldn't stop after 10. And the benefit of being able to provide a personalized learning experience where you get 5 reps, I get 15, because that's exactly what I need for this. And then maybe that's in math. Let's say in English, you need a little more time than I do to go through reading comprehension, right? And do that. That is an incredible part of it. The other thing that we are seeing with generative AI is the ability to take not just the knowledge graph of a student, but overlap that with their interest graph. And so now you can take that child, and there's an app it's called teachtales.com. You can go download it, that we built, that can take the interests that a kid has and then create customized reading material that is at their Lexile level, the proper level. So suddenly that, 7-year-old boy doesn't really like to read, but he loves the Avengers and he's now like the main hero in an Avengers style story that's delivered at the, 6th grade reading level that he needs to be at. That's just the right amount of challenging. That's what's incredible. And so I think I'm really an education like purist when it comes to the fact that, like, how about we educate kids in a way that works and we get them smarter and like doing more. And by the way, we can do it with all kids, not just the smart kids, not just the kids who are struggling. Let's meet every kid where they're at. That gets me so fired up to be able to help kids who are behind, help kids who are ahead, just blow the ceiling off what's possible and move at their pace. And I think that being able to increase human intelligence, as a result of artificial intelligence is like the greatest thing we can be doing. doing. And, not just from an academic perspective, but from a life skills and from a human connection perspective, which, our teachers have time to do. I was just looking at our 24-25 school year data, and, our teachers had 27 one-on-one meetings throughout the school year with each and every one of their students. And I read an article the other month that said that the average teacher gets 22 seconds a day of time one-on-one with a student. And so that right there is just like helping. And I think our greatest, untapped resource is human potential. And I think education is the bottom line. So yeah, data, Shmeda,
Uh,
it's all good data that we're getting.
right. And another question that I think is probably top of mind for folks, especially when they realize this isn't just high school, right? This is middle school, this is elementary school, you're going all the way down to kindergarten.
Hmm.
And there are so many headlines about the fears of kids in particular becoming addicted to AI, having these AI companions that morph their relationships with other humans. How are you getting around that? How are you tackling this concern of sort of addictive intelligence, as some people have referred to it?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I remember in the late 90s when I got to hop on the internet for the first time, and I thought that was pretty crazy, that you're telling me I can like email someone. What is that? How does it even work? And I think that AI is just like any of these other kind of technological advances where we can't just bury our heads in the sand and pretend like it's not there. And that's what unfortunately so many schools had done, was just say, hey, steer clear, because the only thing we know is that you will use it to cheat and write your paper for you. And so we don't want to do that. Instead, we have to face this head on and give kids the tools to be able to understand how to use this AI well, and how to further develop themselves. So, one example though, we've got a high school student who's building an AI plushie that gives mental health advice. And upon first glance, you might think, oh my gosh, I can't think of anything worse than a kid talking to their stuffed animal and getting advice from this. But when you imagine, okay, this is well vetted information that's trained on an LLM that's giving good advice to a kid, a kid can access it for a certain amount of time each day, where they may never get into a therapist's office, because they can't afford it or they don't have access to it or whatever. And this student's spiky point of view is that, this AI plushie might even be able to better relate to a kid who's going through a challenge with a relationship at school than some 50-year-old therapist that their mom found online for him, right, or something there. And so yeah, and one of the things too, to just add to that, it actually has a time limit of how much time you're allowed to speak to it per day, so that this isn't going to become your I've fallen in love with my plushie, this
Right.
is my new companion. I've heard those things happening, but we really believe, let's help kids be familiar and get to know this. The other thing that I found really interesting, and we think about this with technology, and I think AI falls in this kind of category, is especially about middle school, you start seeing kids just being wanting to scroll on TikTok all day or play video games nonstop. And one of the things that we teach our students, and we have so much time to do this, is teach them how to be creators and contributors, not consumers. Right. And so instead of just playing video games all day, how about we help kids learn about how to code and build their own video game? Instead of just playing Fortnite, how about we help them learn how to host and do a shoutcast of a Fortnite tournament, right? And instead of watching TikTok videos, how about we, teach them how to go out and put positive content out on this? And I think kids have a natural desire, just like all humans, to be creators. But when we're not kind of trained on how to do that, we'll tend to fall back. And I think the idea of giving kids ownership and a sense of proactiveness in their learning journey is something that we're doing kind of across the board, right? As opposed to just showing up for school every day, sitting down and being like, I'm going to listen to whatever it is the teacher has to say. And I think that AI is a great example of, we can have all kinds of information right here in the palm of our hand. But what we need to teach people to do is how to use this information well. And things like, ChatGPT is a horrible writer. right? But you know what it's great at? It's a great thought partner and feedback, loop, that we can get. And we need to teach our young people how to do that well.
Yeah, and something that rings so true for me is that the folks who often are deriding uses of AI in insensitive contexts like mental health or in education, they're often in very privileged positions. If you're at a school district that has great teachers and that has all these extracurricular activities and so on and so forth, you're thinking, oh my gosh, no kid should ever learn from AI. We should only have teachers in-person teaching. But go talk to a school district where they have a teacher shortage, or perhaps they don't have a teacher who speaks that child's language, or perhaps doesn't understand
Mhm.
the cultural background. Those are the folks we need to be helping and lending a more innovative and empirically driven approach to education, which tees me up for if I'm sitting and listening to this podcast and I'm a superintendent of education and I'm thinking, okay, MacKenzie has made a pretty dang compelling argument. I've gone and I've done my homework and I've seen Alpha School. Their test results are remarkable. Their graduation rate's super high. How do we scale this? It's
Yeah.
not cheap to go to Alpha School and it's not available everywhere. How do we scale this? What would it look like to see
Yeah.
Alpha School spread?
Well, one of the things I do want to explain with regard to the cost, there is no question Alpha is a super high-end private school experience. We are redefining what parents expect from their kids' private school. And we spend a lot of money on a few different things. One of the things we spend a lot of money at Alpha is on our life skills workshops. So, for example, we did a teamwork and grit workshop where our kids ended up sailing from the Florida Keys to the Bahamas over 5 days, right? Now, that is not something that you can just expect anyone could go do, right? We had a group of kids who flew to Poland and spent a week training 500 Ukrainian refugee students on our 2-hour learning platform. So we do some pretty incredibly extravagant life skills workshops experiences, and that goes into money. So that's one area. The other thing I'm a huge believer in is that you have to pay your teachers well. So we believe in paying teachers. They start at 6 figures. In order to get great people, you gotta compensate them, and I believe teachers should be paid very well. Now, the cost of AI is expensive as well for us. We're spending about 10K per student per year on AI. I think that cost is going to go down dramatically in the next couple of years. We'll see that. But the biggest impediment to scaling this model of education is it truly does require us to just flip over the day of how the school is run. And so if a superintendent was sitting here listening to this, you'd have to ask yourself this question. Are you willing to say, you know what, we're going to put all of our academic learning into 2 hours, and then we're going to unleash kids starting at noon to go do the things they normally start doing at 4 o'clock. Get out on the football field, go to the robotics team, go to the speech and debate club, go to the theater club, all of those activities that public schools have. Let's let the kids do that in the afternoon. And I think it gets so hard for people to think, well, wait, no, kids are in school for 6 hours. That means everything has to be, you know, academic. And I'll have people ask me about that too. They'll say, oh, so your workshops in the afternoon, you're taking like the math that you learn in the morning, and then you're doing like a cool project-based workshop learning that math. And I'm like, nope. The kids are doing things like horseback riding, or getting feedback on playing a sport or building a hoverboard, things like that. And so it really requires that. The other thing I will tell you, Kevin, is we have figured out how to deliver these incredible academic results when they're in the confines of our school buildings, because our teachers are trained on motivation and connecting with kids and figuring out their why and getting every kid excited about working and putting in the effort. But if you just took our learning system and gave it to a kid at home with no real other things, we're not getting those same results. In fact, our homeschool program, we're finally getting better because we've incorporated a bunch of motivation stuff into it. But it took us, we're over a year late on rolling it out because we weren't getting the 2x learning that we were seeing in our schools. And so I think the impediment to scaling is we have to really change the ethos and thought pattern around what school does and how we can spend time there. And, that's getting millions of teachers bought into the idea that they're not going to be teaching subjects like math or science or reading, and instead they're going to become experts on each and every one of their kids. Now, what I will say is, as soon as I've met very few teachers who, after a conversation, aren't excited about this. They're like, oh, that sounds so much more fulfilling because, unfortunately, our teachers in the traditional system, they have been given a bucket with holes in it and expected to go empty the ocean. It's an impossible job. And that's why we're seeing so many teachers leaving the field, and not attracting the level and quality that we want. They're underpaid, they're overworked, and they're underappreciated. And I do believe in this model, it could get better. Now, I think in the public world, and we've already seen this, I've been rejected by numerous states for charter status. I think the public world is going to want, lots of data, lots of research. Let's think about it like pharmaceuticals. Let's make sure this works before we go in and do this. And so that's what I'm doing. I'm building my own kind of private distribution channel to be able to show that this works in quite a few different settings, and with different themes of what kids are focused on in the afternoons and how they're learning life skills. And I think this could eventually get there from a cost perspective, but it is going to require a lot of effort. And so it's part of the reason I spend a lot of time, on future of education, on my social media, on podcasts, and talking to people to help them see there is this better way to do this, that school can be a place that, again, kids love, and that where motivation and high standards can work hand in hand together, and where, personalized learning can happen, via AI. And I don't think we're as far away as, think about how much has changed in just the last 6 months, how much more familiar people are getting, and they're less scared of this. But it's going to take a lot. I don't envy, the powers that be who are trying to figure this out. Although, the current administration did a whole thing around let's become AI forward. The biggest thing I would say is I really hope it doesn't look like slapping a chatbot on every kid's computer and calling it a day.
Right.
Or hey teacher, use ChatGPT to give you some ideas on how to more creatively teach a lesson. I really propose that the model of the teacher in front of the classroom gets flipped.
Well, and I think it's critical to acknowledge that you all, as you pointed out, this isn't a mere coloring being added to the outside of the exterior of the car. You replace the engine of education and really
Mhm.
flip the script, as you've noted. And from a policy perspective, if we go in for those quick fixes without changing the institutional incentives and dynamics, or if we start to allow for folks who are less committed to you all to developing robust internal tools, for example, let's say you get a knockoff version that wants to sell that student data, or maybe not train their teachers or pay teachers as well as you are. I see those concerns, which is all the more reason to double down on studying your model and sharing it broadly. And I'm just so glad that you took the time amid summer break, at least for some of your students, to come on Scaling Laws and talk with me. Thank you so much, MacKenzie.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. I'm excited to see how education can change. Let's not make it spinach anymore. Let's make it like the best, most healthy, wonderful dessert.
I love it. I'm thinking, some dark chocolate fudge, maybe. I don't know. Well, we can debate that later. But thanks again.
Thank you.
Rebecca, I spoke earlier with MacKenzie Price about a unique education available here in Austin at the Alpha School. According to Price, their unique education system has allowed kids to shave hours off of their daily classroom time. But most schools, I'd say 99%, if not 99.9% of schools, have yet to completely lean into AI, at least in the same way as the Alpha School. A RAND survey from the fall of 2024 reported that just 48% of U.S. school districts had trained teachers on the use of AI. So we get the sense that school districts here are tepidly thinking through how best to integrate generative AI into the classroom. And that's just here in the US, which likes to think of itself as the leader in AI and as some of the most forward-thinking adopters and early adopters of AI. So, Rebecca, given your years of thinking about international education policy and the fact that you're leading Brookings Global Task Force on AI in education, let's just start at a very, very high level. Is the U.S. a laggard, a leader? Where do we land in your estimation right now?
Oh gosh. Okay. So lagger versus leader, everybody wants league tables. Well, one thing I will say, and you can make your determination yourself, Kevin, is that China, which does have a centralized education system, which the US does not, we are a Jeffersonian democracy and all that that means. So basically, we're either 50 education systems for each state or, thousands and thousands based on the number of districts who have a great deal of control, local control over education. But China has adopted an AI literacy policy, which will roll out this September for their kids. And it is comprehensive, and I'm not an expert on it, but I think the broad strokes that I know of are in the right direction, which is, they get young kids familiar with the technology, but then they do a lot of, in elementary school, how does it actually work, which isn't necessarily in front of a computer or with technology. It's what is an LLM? What is generative AI? How does it work? What are some of the pitfalls like hallucinations? How can it be different when you feed it different information? How do you think about asking good questions? All these things. And it sort of scaffolds children's learning up till when they get into their equivalent of high school, secondary school, where kids are using it to create new things. So not just passive consumers, but this is a cool tool. How would you go out and solve a problem, maybe together with your peers, to create something new? And all of those things, I think, are really important when it comes to the world of AI literacy. And that's one small dimension of your big question, which is how is AI being used in schools? And the thing I want to say is AI literacy is extremely important because it is how we can help our young people really understand this new technology and be fluent with it. And there's a great new draft framework, which I encourage anyone who's interested to look at, which we've been, our folks on our team have been engaged with over its development, along with many, many, many others across the globe. This comes out of the OECD and the European Union, and there's a great organization collaborative here called Teach AI that's been heavily engaged. And they really say you need 4 things, which is you need kids to learn how to engage with it. You need kids to learn how to manage it, because we're going to be managing a lot of AI in the workplace, in our lives. And you need kids to be able to create with it, which is what I talked about vis-a-vis China. And lastly, you need kids to learn how to design AI. Not that everyone is going to go on and be a massive working in AI, one of the mega AI labs, and design AI, but to, in my mind, say, hey, this is not like the law of physics. This is not something like the earth revolves around the sun that we are probably not going to change. This is changeable. This is man-made. We can design AI however we want. And the rules of the road have been designed by large companies, for-profit companies, for the most part, and they can be changed if we want. So that's a chunk on AI literacy. I do want to get into, if you're willing, I want to get into AI use in education systems more broadly, because that's a different story.
Yes. No, I would love to. I think it's worth pausing for a second to just get a sense of the spectrum of how AI is being used, because as we discussed at Alpha School, for example, that's a whole reimagining of what education looks like around AI. Whereas in most contexts, whether in the States or in China, or let's say Estonia, which is similarly forward thinking in this regard and trying to get their students exposed to AI at an early age, learning some of those 4 dimensions and achieving some degree of AI literacy. in those contexts, in most contexts, we're not seeing how do we reorient the sort of student-teacher dynamic like at Alpha School, but instead just how do we integrate generative AI into the classroom. And what's so essential about this, something that you pointed out, but I don't think receives enough attention, is the US can reach AGI, artificial general intelligence, or develop a super intelligent system. But if the general public doesn't know how to use it, it's not very valuable. And so I just think centering on this AI literacy conversation is so essential. And I want to learn more about your perspective on how we're seeing generative AI in the education system. But before we go into that rabbit hole, which I think will be a deep one, can you just tell us, what is this task force itself? Brookings
Yes.
sets up this global task force. What is
Yes.
it? What are y'all doing?
Yeah. So we started this Brookings Global Task Force on AI in Education in September of 2024, launched on the margins of the UN General Assembly meetings, because in my mind, generative AI is cataclysmic, not only for the world, but for education. And I literally put it up there. My colleagues and I talk about this. The printing press, the internet, generative AI.
Wow.
Like, it is
In
of
that
that
order?
level for sort of the transformative highway or the transformative canvas of teaching and learning. And we need to get ahead of it, because we, education, families, teachers, school leaders, school counselors, coaches, anybody who works with kids needs to have a voice in how this is going to be rolled out, how it's going to work, what is good for kids, what isn't good for kids. We should have been at the table and had a much bigger voice and leaned in, frankly, when social media was rolled out 10 years ago. And we didn't. As parents and families, like, oh, this is a good thing, it's going to connect our kids. Okay, here's a cell phone. To little did we know, we were giving them, I tell my own children, I don't let you walk around at midnight in the most dangerous parts of not just my city, any city.
You're a good
And I'm not
parent in
going to
that
let you
regard.
walk around in the most dangerous parts of the online world either, which is, why my kids are, rolling their eyes at me every time I talk about online safety. But that was the right thing to do. And most people didn't know that. So we really established a task force, learning a lesson and taking a page from what we should have done when we rolled out social media when it came to phones and kids. Because frankly, 10 years ago, we knew that social comparisons, particularly for adolescents, possibly particularly for girls, are a bad thing. We didn't need to wait 10 years to see all the negative impacts that are coming, to say, oops, it's a bad thing. So let's not take the same wait and see approach with our young people's formation and future with AI. That's the motivation. And in terms of what we're doing is
Can we just pause
Yeah.
there for just
Yeah.
1 second? Because I think this is such a consequential comparison, because to your point, social media doesn't have a ton of educational upsides, right? We're not saying, hey, go to Facebook and that's where you're going to learn about calculus. And if you start a Facebook thread, you're probably going to get robust feedback on how best to solve this equation. You might, but it's not designed around facilitating education, or we don't have versions of Facebook necessarily that are really pro-educational. Whereas we can imagine generative AI tools explicitly serving that purpose, right? You can design a GPT to be
I
your
don't know,
tutor.
Kevin. I see your point. I see your point, and I think it's a worthy one to point out. But I think social media is used for education all the time. I think TikTok, people are learning all sorts of things, whether it's stuff we want them to learn, but how to do a skateboard trick, or how to cook stuff, or how to crochet, or how to pass my AP test, and certainly YouTube and Insta and whatever. There's everything under the sun, just like in humanity. So kids do use it to learn stuff. And that's actually part of the problem. It's like, it's not 100% bad. there are ways that kids connect and play and learn about the world and form real bonds. It does happen on social media. The problem is it's mixed in with a lot of bad stuff. So I think your point is that it's probably easier to design a generative AI tool for a learning user use case. Is that what you mean?
That's part of the point. I think my other point is that the ease with which we can just say, oh, we don't want to repeat social media with respect to the AI world. We got everything so wrong on social media is kind of the common discourse now. We can't repeat that in AI. And so we're maybe approaching it more from a fearful stance than a approach of experimentation and thoughtful adoption.
Right.
But
Right.
tell me if I'm getting that wrong. I'm very curious to hear in
So,
your circles, what are folks
yeah,
saying,
I
or what's
mean,
the general approach?
I see, I see kind of two ends of a spectrum. And one, and I'll tell you my perspective. One is a FOMO. Like, oh my gosh, this new thing is here. I gotta use it. I gotta use it. And even if I don't need to.
Right, right.
So this is not helpful, actually. And it actually will come back to bite us because it won't be that additive, could have risks and downsides, and then you'll get a backlash in a year, 2 years, like, oh, this wasn't worth it. So I see folks who are out there being like, well, we got to use generative AI. And it's like, but for what purpose? If you need to calm down a kid and give them a hug is what calms them down, give them a frickin' hug. Do not create an app
Right.
to make them, say, I need a hug.
Hug
I'm,
GPT, not going to catch on.
I'm making that up, but it's not that far away from the truth. So we need to be really intentional about our use cases. There are things we absolutely do not need to use generative AI for. If kids need a hug, they fell down, they're having a bad day, give them a hug. If you're a parent, you need to ask your child, how are you doing today? How do you feel? Look them in the eyes and talk to them. You
Well,
do not need an app.
this is crazy advice here. Slow down, Rebecca.
Honestly, and there's a piece I wrote that say we need a minimalist mindset around AI in education. And it was actually based off of work I'd done globally with a fabulous real guru of the ed tech world, Marshall Smith, who's sadly no longer with us, but he was a champion of the open educational resources movement. And he and I really dug into this. This is ages ago, really about how do we bring tech to education systems that have very little technology, and can we leapfrog? And part of where we saw it go wrong was this same FOMO attitude. We did not think very carefully, what do you need to do? If you can do it very well without tech and it works great, do not introduce technology, because inevitably when you introduce technology, there's retraining, there's technology maintenance, there's all sorts of things that you have to consider. If you don't need it to get the job done, don't use it. So that's the FOMO side.
Which is
That
a
is
great
coming
point
up
of
with
the
could
just
be
the
coming up with brilliant stuff. There is brilliant stuff I've seen, but also comes up with a lot of stupid stuff. And then there's on the other end of the spectrum, there's folks who I have a great deal of sympathy with, who are saying, I want all technology out, gone. I am burned. My children can't hold a conversation with me anymore, or their grandmother, or each other. I am, and there's a big parent movement globally in the US and globally that is pushing back against cell phones in the classroom, but also all technology. Now, I understand and I sympathize, because there is a feeling, rightly so, that the folks who are making a lot of money off of technology for young people do not have the young people's well-being as their top priority. And that is well documented, right? This idea of let's just take social media. You get credit. There's an engagement model, which is, if I can get a kid to spend an extra hour on social media, let's just take social media, on Instagram, whatever, pick your platform, That comes back to Instagram as a job well done. You got them to spend an extra hour. It doesn't matter if they're researching suicide tips on how to kill themselves. It's the same because it's this engagement model that maximizes attention, not well-being. So there's a lot of people who are like, it's over, it's done. I shall not trust you ever again. I don't want any tech. Now, I worry about that piece because for two reasons, because you might throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of technology in the classroom and in schools it's doing amazing stuff. Just look no further than inclusive education. There's incredible technology, excuse me. My son is dyslexic, incredible technology for kids with dyslexia, also dysgraphia, all sorts of things, enabling young people to really access and learn when they were not. That's one small example. So those are your two end of the spectrums. I think somewhere in there is a happy middle. And that's what we're trying to find out in the task force. And we're doing it through three questions, really. One, it's a pre-mortem. So it's saying we're not going to wait. We do not need to wait 3 years, 5 years, 10 years to see, did some bad stuff happen with AI in education and children's learning and development? We can look at the learning sciences, child development, look at the technology, and make an educated prediction. Pre-mortems are really good when the future is uncertain. And so our three questions are, what are the risks that AI poses to children's learning and development? And it's very specifically generative AI. Second, what can we do today to mitigate those risks? And third, what are the upsides and benefits and opportunities that we could therefore harness in a more risk-free space?
And on that first question, because I'm fascinated by this idea of a pre-mortem, to be honest, it's the first time I've ever come across this idea. I'm a public policy master's degree holder, and I've never heard of a pre-mortem, so I was very jazzed from just an academic standpoint to hear about this. Do you have any concern by focusing on what could go wrong about the technology rather than what could go right, that perhaps we're missing out on the sort of root and stem change that we're seeing, for instance, at Alpha School? Are we being radical enough in thinking through, what if we reoriented education entirely around AI? Is that something that your task force is at all looking at, or is that kind of outside the ambit?
No, so I'm not worried about that because we're focusing on those two scenarios. So, our first launch consultation was a launch event. It wasn't an actual research event, but we had two headlines and people had to break in. One was, it's whatever, 2040, and everything has gone incredibly well for AI in education and children's learning and development. What happened? And the other was, damning evidence that AI in education is a disaster. What happened? So we're definitely looking at both. But the reason we're doing a pre-mortem, there's a whole science behind pre-mortems, and they're quite frequent in places like cybersecurity or other sectors away from education. We have not yet found an example of a tech rollout in education that has used a pre-mortem. And I think we actually, maybe one lesson, we'll see how it goes, but one lesson is maybe we should do that, because in general, the tech rollout is, oh, there's this cool thing. It's like, it's a screwdriver. What can we use a screwdriver for? Let's go around the building and see, can I use it for a chalkboard? No, and you sort of figure out, oh, to screw in the screws of the door. That's helpful. There's a lot of experimentation. And I say this around, I'm really just talking about digital technology, where the entire approach is release, experiment, iterate, change, release, experiment, iterate, change. And I'm actually a big fan of that approach in learning. But, when you're talking about really significant technology that can have serious detrimental impacts on what's more formative than your learning and development as a young person? Your mental health, your well-being, your socialization, your ability to attend. These are really big things that we shouldn't muck around with too much. I think it is totally reasonable to say, okay, let's not experiment with everything. Let's see what might be some useful, rules of the road, some useful guardrails, and then experiment within that. Just to be clear, I haven't actually visited Alpha schools, but I've been tracking them for a while. They've been around for 10 years. Their innovation was not generative AI. It was predictive AI, which has a right answer and a wrong answer. And I would argue that their big innovation was basically giving students a ton of autonomy and agency, and giving them a lot of choice around what they wanted to do. And that was their big innovation, actually, which was very, very human-centered. And there is a qualitative difference between predictive AI and generative AI in education and learning. Predictive AI has been shown to be used in many different applications and ways to be very, very, very helpful for learning. There's a right and wrong answer. It's, for example, for your listeners who might not know, if I'm a kid and I'm on Prodigy, which is a video game, and that's math learning, and it's fantastic. And I'm like, 2 + 2 = 5. Prodigy will say no. And then I'll give you another chance to learn how to think about 2 + 2. And eventually when you get that it = 4, it'll let you move on to the right answer. Now, generative AI is completely different. It does all the thinking for you. It does all the creation for you. And in many ways, what we've been doing in education, those folks who are experimenting, is trying to figure out how to hold back the power of generative AI. Certainly when it comes to interfaces with kids, direct interfaces. And even maybe teachers. Like, I'm not talking about incredible use cases, which are like curriculum alignment and refugee camps, which talked to Learning Equality recently, a great nonprofit, that it went down from 1,000 hours to, 3 days. It's like 3 years to 3 days to do this, incredible uses. Or bus schedules, which is a pain in the butt for schools. Like, these are incredible back office uses. I'm talking about the direct interface with kids. And I am really worried about it, actually.
And you are in a very unique position for this conversation, because as much as there's a concern about differences in use cases and capacity and institutional resources in the US with respect to, let's say, well-off communities and low-income communities, you have a vantage point of a global scale of giving us a sense of how, in many cases, we refer to it as global South communities, for example, as compared to the global North or global majority. And I'm keen to hear your perspective on whether we're seeing that kind of degree of FOMO really manifest in the global South, where we have, for good or for ill, and probably in between in all those cases, we have companies coming in and saying, look, you're a classroom with one teacher to 50 or 60 or 70 students. Let's just run with generative AI because we have this one randomized control trial with 12 students that showed that it was vastly better than anything else we can do. Are we seeing that sort of real push to try to force AI into global South communities, or what's going on in some of those countries? And I know we're painting with an incredibly broad brush, but I'm eager to hear.
So I think what we're finding, and I should say, when people are listening to this podcast, we are sort of in the middle of our research for our AI task force. The report will be launched in January 2026. But what we are finding in the midst is two worlds. There is a world where generative AI and, frankly, just digital technology is awash in children's lives. These might be, middle-class kids in urban, medium-sized towns to urban centers in the US that have a cell phone, they have a Chromebook at school, they have an Apple Watch, they have a, Nintendo, they have, they have a TV, like all this stuff that streams. And then that's one world where the conversation is about how do we stop and rein some of this back, some of this access back, because in fact, generative AI has not been designed for kids. It is not optimized for kids. It is not optimized for learning. And even just the internet writ large is, there's a lot of stuff in humanity we don't want our kids exposed to. And then there's a separate conversation in communities that have that I would say are left behind technologically. Those could be Native American reservations in the US, they could be rural communities. There's places who do not have broadband in the US, or it could be countries in sub-Saharan Africa or communities in Latin America or what have you. And the conversation in those communities is either, I don't even know what you're talking about. I've not seen this. And folks who've seen a little bit of it, it's, oh my gosh, how on earth are we ever going to catch up if this is the power that people in other communities, really it's heavily rural urban often, our kids are being, educated on, or people are using. And then the other part of the conversation is, wow, this could help us so much bridge some of our access gaps. And it is really in, again, left behind communities. So there's, we did an event recently, a Brookings webinar, and it's online, people can check it out, but looking at, rural communities, marginalized communities. We had a speaker on who was using generative AI to help girls get educated in Afghanistan, when they are no longer allowed to go to school, particularly at secondary school, via WhatsApp. And it was brilliant. We also had someone talking about helping boost the capacity of school counselors who were using back office generative AI to really get to know students and zoom in, a live person, synchronous, zoom into rural schools where there was no mental health supports for rural schools. There just wasn't any school counselors in that town, and those kids needed help. And it wasn't that they were talking to AI about their mental health problems, totally inappropriate, but they were using AI to really augment their ability to know the kids, know the context, know what's happening, rather than sifting through pages and pages of notes, etc. So there's, I think, very exciting use cases. I'm like excited and terrified all at the same time. Basically.
Right. And what strikes me is that this is such a monumental challenge. My mom was a student aide at my elementary school many years after I graduated. Don't worry, she wasn't passing me answers or anything like that. And
I wasn't worried.
yeah, something that struck her was, and I think this is true of anyone who knows an educator, especially an early educator, they work so dang hard, and they are trying so hard to keep up with new curriculum, to keep up with new mandates from the school district, to take all these new trainings. And I just wonder what level of alarm, speaking in a US context, what level of alarm or what level of just a kind of all-out dedication to training teachers do we need? Because right now it kind of seems like in the teaching context, as well as in a lot of contexts, it's a, hey, come take this 1 hour webinar on how to use GPT. It'll be great. And then go off and have fun. Are you seeing real kind of substantive, days long engagement by any school districts, or are we still working towards something like that?
So I think and you rightly are pointing this out. I think we need to separate the conversation in AI and education with what can adults in the education system do, teachers, school leaders, transportation coordinators, cafeteria, lunchroom, whatever. The bell schedule in any given school is like just a nightmare of a thing to do. What can adults use AI for? And it will be things around efficiency, new productivity, and which really will free up time. And we're seeing that already. There's a Gallup Walton Family Foundation survey that has come out that really shows teachers are using it and saving time. And that is great. And it might be that we're able to do things we haven't ever envisioned before. But that often, I think, gets into how we craft teaching and learning experiences, where that's where we're interfacing with kids. Mm-hmm. And so it could be like in some schools that you are doing your academic learning in one part of the day with a, teachers, but also support from an AI tutor. It helps individualize it, be adaptive. And then you get a lot more time during the day to practice, to do homework. Maybe you never ever have homework again. I was in a school recently in France who said, we are no more. Enough is enough. We are spent. The teachers submitted a petition to the Ministry of Education. This was a high school for September. I don't know yet if it was approved, saying, teachers, we are spending so much time running all our kids' homework through AI plagiarism checkers. It's a big freaking waste of time. This is ridiculous. Let's just take that time and cut down a little bit on our direct teaching hours, and have all kids practice what they're learning by doing homework in class, in school. And then we'll make sure they're actually developing the skills. So there's all sorts of ways that people are going to react. I mean, I do think there is one pathway when we think about teaching and learning that is very, very hopeful and optimistic. And it really is about helping every kid master the knowledge and content and sort of skills, academic skills that they need better, more effectively, and then marry that and use those skills and knowledge to try to solve something and do something in the real world. So if I learn about, length times width of a rectangle gives me the area, and then I can go and figure out how much paint I need to paint a fence. At the moment, most kids can't make that leap. They cannot marry their knowledge acquisition with their knowledge application. It's called transfer. It's a huge problem. And it's because our teaching and learning processes are too divorced from real life. So that, if we could get AI to help us do that, it would be amazing. But that is I think we have a very narrow path to success. There are many other paths, and I want to make sure to say this to get it out there. There are many other paths that are terrible for kids teaching and learning. I have a LinkedIn newsletter called Winthrop's World of Education, and I did this in my newsletter a while ago, where I likened it to the technology to a new shoe that a shoe company invented, like for babies. So you could buy the shoe, and it's a miraculous baby walking shoe, and nobody needs to crawl. My colleague Mary Helena Mordino Yang and Kathy Hirsch-Bashik and I were batting this idea around, and we as child development experts would say, just because you can buy a shoe, put it on a baby, and they can start walking around and they can skip the crawling process, we would say that's a bad idea, because it's actually not about fast forwarding to walking. Crawling is not just a support for walking. It's actually about developing spatial awareness. So if you get backed into a corner, you know how to get out of it. It actually connects the left brain with the right brain hemispheres of the brain. There's so many benefits from crawling.
I still get stuck in corners. Yeah. I must have skipped it there.
So it's the same with generative AI. Generative AI can do all the schoolwork that we assign currently, basically. Do we want to let kids do that? I don't think so. I think they need to, neurobiologically, they need to go through a lot of these processes to develop basic thinking skills, literally basic thinking skills. And if you think about it, this is one thing coming out of our task force. What does generative AI do? It's incredible at pattern recognition. And what is education and learning for kids? It's pattern recognition. Learning the sounds of letters, put them together, makes a phenome, learn how to read, learn math, learn science. It's all pattern recognition. So I do worry that we, open the door too wide when it comes to teaching and learning, and we could veer wildly off course.
So we're coming up in a really interesting AI regulatory window where Congress has failed to pass an AI moratorium. States are weighing hundreds, if not thousands, of AI-related bills. And we see school districts, many of them, in some cases, according to some polls, a majority or close to 50% still haven't announced formal AI policies. So let's assume you're sitting down with a state superintendent of education or secretary of education, you pick the title. Are there one or two major policy proposals or policy suggestions you would have for them in terms of navigating this world and preparing their state's youth?
This is super complicated. And it's a legislative nightmare because there's a gajillion different initiatives. Companies don't love it because they are like, well, this is really hard to navigate. How am I going to sell to the whole country or the whole world when everybody has different rules? They don't love it. And I guess I would say the following. If I were talking to, and I do, state or any jurisdiction, a jurisdiction leader, I would say the following. One, you may be in charge of schools, but don't forget that what we do in our schools is only 50% of what's going to solve this problem. Because most of the time, well, one, kids are, well, let me finish that thought. Because what we do, inside schools is incredibly important. It's where we have focused a lot of our education energies. But kids are accessing this outside of school. I mean, at the moment, ChatGPT, the number one active weekly user, according to an OpenAI study last year, is college-age students, 18 to 24. Students and kids are a massive user case for these big AI labs. And in fact, we'll date the timing of recording of this podcast because XAI, Elon Musk's AI company, just came out with Grok, his LLM model for babies. He's saying he just announced they're going to do it. So, Lord help us. So what is happening outside of school is equally important. And we are going to have a new approach to sort of teacher-parent collaboration on steroids, sort of school system, outside of school time, family use. How are we going to do two things at the same time? Help our kids develop great AI literacy skills, help them even co-create. I mean, I think one of the best things we should do is give if we can figure it out, give a walled garden, so an LLM model that has a certain amount of content protected to teachers, school leaders, and students. And in small periods of time, let them experiment and say, how would you use this and be really clear, like, wow, this can do your essays for you and your math problem sets. But we don't want that to happen because you need to learn this stuff. So how would you use it to make learning more exciting, learn better? And they might come up with great approaches. We see South Australia doing this sort of walled garden protective experimental use. Because at the moment, by not having guidance at a school level, I've spoken to so many kids and they are using it. They're like, I write my essay and then I go and I get the essay question, I put in ChatGPT, I run it through an AI humanizer, I turn it in, it makes typos and it makes, 7th grade vocabulary level. So my teacher can't tell. Schools up and down, students up and down are like, yeah, I use it. And my teachers can't tell. So the current path is not sustainable.
Yeah, and what I love about that remark is since my honors college thesis at the University of Oregon, I've been obsessed with 0 to 5 education. And I don't need to tell you, but whatever happens between those years of 0 to 5 is pretty determinative of how you're going to do down the road.
Absolutely.
And we're not talking a whole lot about 0 to 5 and parents and babies, and apparently we need to. Thanks, Elon. But
Absolutely.
Rebecca, you've got a lot of work to do, and I can't wait to hear more about it. We'll have to have you back on in January when your task
Absolutely, I would
force
love it.
wraps up its work. But for now, we'll let you go. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you so much, Kevin. It was a pleasure to be here.